Hello, BookTube. I have a tag for you today. I originally tried to do it yesterday because it's a comic book themed tag, and yesterday is Wednesday, is New Comic Book Day. Couldn't quite manage to do it yesterday, but I have high hopes to get through the whole thing today. It's the Comic Love book tag. It was created by Lazy Owl, and I saw it on Breakeven Books. And I will try to remember to leave a link to both of those channels down below. And it's about comic books. I usually do 2 comic book related videos on this channel every week on Wednesday and Friday. Don't know if that's going to happen this week, but I thought this would maybe make up just in case I don't. And question number 1 is very simple. What comic book series made you fall in love with comics? I've mentioned it on this channel many times. It started out being Superboy. In Superboy and Adventure Comics, it started out being the adventures of Superman when he was a boy, a teenage Clark Kent in Smallville, with Ma and Pa Kent and Smallville High and his crush Lana Lang and his friend Pete Ross and his classmates and gangsters, lots and lots of gangsters, but also lots of extraterrestrial visitors who happen to show up in Smallville. And I fell in love with those stories. I absolutely loved them in the late 40s and all through the mid 50s. Those were the comics that that run of Superboy I absolutely love. I just absolutely love it. Even to the point where it wasn't satisfying. There were ways in which those Superboy adventures were not satisfying. One way in particular, which is that I kept wondering, well, I've read Superman, of course. I've read Superman. I've read the Justice League. I've read World's Finest, where Superman teams up with Batman. But what are you, the editors of DC Comics, telling readers about Superboy, the adventures of Superman when he was a boy? Are you telling us that at this point in time, Clark Kent is the only superpowered being in the world? Does he know that? He seems to travel to other planets. Does he know that he's alone in the world? It always struck me as an opportunity for storytelling that was wasted. But of course, the editors wasted no time in making him less alone. Alien visitors came to Smallville on a regular basis. One of them was Krypto, the superdog from Krypton, who became Superboy's best friend. And another group of friends expanded my love of the first series that I fell in love with, because one of the alien visitors storylines in Adventure Comics involved 3 superpowered teenagers who came back in time from the future. They knew perfectly well that Clark Kent was Superboy, and they were members of the Legion of Superheroes, a superhero team 1,000 years in the future, and they came back in time to induct Superboy into their club. Because he was kind of their inspiration. It turned out later on he was kind of their inspiration. And the Legion of Superheroes took off. I and many other readers loved it, wanted more of the Legion. And eventually the Legion started getting more backup stories of its own, and then billing as Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. They got that, and they've gone on since then to have their own comic. They have an ongoing comic right now from DC Comics. And what started out as Superboy became Superboy and the Legion. It was Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes that really did it for me. But the 2 are inextricable, because I'm not sure that I would have fallen in love with the Legion if I hadn't already been in love with Superboy and Superdog. so I'm going to go with Superboy and the Legion. Question number 2 is the most underappreciated or underhyped comic book. I have one in mind. I think I've mentioned it on this channel before. There was a very early prototypical video game, Atari, and the company that made Atari contacted DC Comics to make a comic book out of their video games, out of their video game, the background, the conceptual background and whatnot, the visual properties of their video games. And DC agreed. There was a large amount of money for the time on the table. And they started out with this, a graphic novel, the first graphic novel, Star Raiders. This was written by Elliot Maggin, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Superman writer, and drawn by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, who is fantastic. He still works today. He was incredible, and this is all just beautiful painted work. It's not all 9-page panels either. He varies things up quite a bit. And this is just gorgeous work. He's just an amazing, amazing artist. And here, he and Maggin in this graphic novel, $6 for a graphic novel. In this graphic novel, he and Megan fleshed out a universe. And then there was an ongoing monthly comic book called Atari Force. Jerry Conway did the writing. It was, but Jose Luis Garcia Lopez drew at least the first 6 or 7 issues and did a fantastic job. I thought those early issues were just first-rate comic book science fiction. It's possible that I wrote in letters to that effect. Lots of people did. It was not the only time that lightning struck like that. I think it was Marvel Comics got the same kind of toy adaptation rights to something called Micronauts, and they put Mike Golden, the artist Mike Golden, on the comic, and it was incredible, absolutely incredible. First few issues of Micronauts, well worth rereading. I wish I could find them. I wish I could find Atari Force. That would be great. But those things did happen. But I think now, if you were to look, if you were like at a flea market and you came across, a bag of Atari Force comic books, you might think, oh, what's that? I vaguely remember Atari as a game when my parents were children, but what could a comic book be? And you'd be missing something. If it's the first 6 or 7 issues of the monthly comic book, you'd be missing something good. So I'd say that's about as underrated as it gets. Then number 3 is most loved LGBTQ comic. A little bit of a problematic question here from me, of course. Comic books are not census forms. It's not their job to represent you personally. But I do have not so much an answer as a meditation. A meditation on a gay character. And those of you who are old-time comic book fans may disagree, or maybe you may secretly agree. The character I'm talking about is Quicksilver. Pietro Maximoff, the brother of Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, who started out as a member of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. He has superpowers. He is super fast. He can run super fast. And then became a member of the Avengers, in good standing for years, a member of the Avengers under Captain America. Captain America, Hawkeye, Quicksilver, and the Scarlet Witch were a great era on the Avengers. And Quicksilver has remained a staple of the team on and off for many years after that. And long before the Stonewall riots, long before it became a fad to speculate about such things, I was speculating about Quicksilver and wondering if maybe the skeleton key that might explain so many of the odd ways that he was portrayed, so many of the odd things that he did, might be simply that he was gay and repressed. He was from Eastern Europe in the Sputnik era, so he wouldn't have been able to know what he was or to admit what he was. No such thing as a pride parade or anything like that. He had an absent mother. He had a distant but overbearing father. the mutant Magneto. It's about as distant and overbearing as it gets. Had a hyper intense emotional connection to his sister, almost incestuous. Had a skin tight costume. You could chalk that up to being super fast, but also a weird hairdo and a chip on his shoulder that was never fully explained. Later writers explained it by saying that Quicksilver was partaking of the megalomania that was a part of his father's personality. And there's been a strong temptation for many years to make Quicksilver a villain, to have him just follow in the footsteps of his father, who he resembles. But I thought, I've often thought that he gets injured in battle at one point and has a traumatic recovery and falls in love with and marries the young woman who nurses him back to health and has a child with her. It's like every single aspect of his story seems plucked from the stereotypical repressed gay handbook. That I've always thought, what sense it would make to just have Quicksilver realize that having lived to an enlightened era, have him realize that I just need to admit this. That's all. But instead, Marvel Comics, the publisher of the Avengers and the creator of Quicksilver, had to go so far towards this they had to go so far as to create a knockoff of Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch. They had to create a knockoff pair of characters, a Canadian brother and sister duo, they both have super speed powers. The man, Northstar, has super speed powers. He has an arrogant personality. He has a weird hairdo. And then Marvel had him come out as gay. And all I could think was, well, okay, great. But what you clearly wanted to do was have this happen with Quicksilver. And I don't know why you didn't. Quicksilver is a C-list character. He's always going to be a C-list character. What harm would it do? Especially since, unlike, for instance, having Bobby Drake, Iceman of the X-Men, come out as gay, which doesn't make any sense at all, considering the character's history, with Quicksilver, it does make sense. It would make sense in every way to have it happen. But and what a comic you could have, good Lord, with him confronting his father. I mean, there have been many Quicksilver-Magneto confrontation issues, many story arcs of one kind or another. The dynamic in the Maximoff family has been done really well, but I would love to see that. Instead, though, we're never going to see it, because somebody at Marvel had to think the same way that I do, because it's no coincidence that the character who came out as gay, Northstar, is a Quicksilver knockoff instead of, a knockoff of the ever-loving blue-eyed Thing or something like that. Somebody at Marvel clearly thought the way I did and just got a no. I bet somebody took it up the chain of command to an editor-in-chief's office and was told no, absolutely not. No. Who knows? But it's not technically a gay character, but I'm gonna use Quicksilver. In my mind, he always will be. Then question number 4 is most loved comic book hero sidekick. I had a while thinking about this because the whole concept of a sidekick has become so alien now that, as far as I know, nobody does it anymore. It used to be an absolutely standard thing that a non-superpowered vigilante, a masked vigilante that is just a guy in a costume, or in some cases a guy who doesn't wear a costume, would take on a teenage boy or a young boy, a preteen boy, as a fellow crusader in the fight against crime. And it, even when it was happening in its heyday in the 30s and 40s with Captain America and Bucky, with Batman and Robin, it never made any sense. Green Arrow and Speedy, whole bunch of other, the Sandman and Sandy, it never made any sense. You read 80 million of those Golden Age Batman comics where Batman and Robin are creeping through the woods, or they're fighting people in a warehouse, and suddenly the villains get the drop on them from a balcony or something with a row of machine guns pointed at them and say, stop where you are or we'll mow you down. And they do. They have to. They've lost. The bad guys have won, and the bad guys are either going to mow them down right there, or they're going to come up with some Baroque form of torture and then leave them so that they can conveniently escape. And the thing that always struck me when I was watching scenes like that is if the bad guy decides to just open fire, it isn't just Batman who dies. It's a little boy who dies as well. Robin wasn't a teenager in those issues. And that just seems to me to be morally and ethically indefensible, in addition to all of the other aspects of it that seem, let's just say, weird. Years and years ago, decades ago, Stan Lee wrote a book called The Origins of Marvel Comics. And at one point, he has a precious deadpan aside about how weird sidekicks are. He made a point of not having them in his own rebirth of Marvel Comics. And he made a point, specifically when it comes to Batman, of, isn't this a little odd that this grown man takes as his partner in fighting crime a boy who is an innocent, and who, if he gets killed, and Robin comes close to being killed by the bad guys all the time. So does Bucky. And many other teenage sidekicks. They exist to be rescued. And the ethical implications of that are just inescapable. What would happen if they did die? So as far as sidekicks go, I don't know how to name a favorite, because the whole phenomenon struck me as so strange. Now, maybe that's just that my favorite superhero was always Superman, Superboy, and they don't have sidekicks. Superman works alone. So he doesn't charge off into battle with somebody. But even if he did, that person would probably have superpowers, right? Captain Marvel. Not any of the Marvel iterations, the Marvel Comics iterations, but the real Captain Marvel, the Fawcett Captain Marvel. had two young characters who weren't exactly sidekicks. Captain Marvel Jr. and Mary Marvel would sometimes share adventures with him, but they were as powerful as he was. And they were knockoffs of his in a literal sense, but they weren't looking up to. Well, the dynamic was totally different. But most sidekicks are the sidekicks of people who don't have superpowers, who can't protect them in any way. And the sidekick that came to mind here is one of the most modern ones that I know of, and one of the funniest ones, and that is Arthur, the vaguely moth-like sidekick to the Tick. Arthur is a CPA. He doesn't know how to throw a punch, and his costume only unreliably allows him to fly. And he wouldn't have the first idea what to do if he encountered genuine danger from a mafia underworld. But unlike most of the other characters in the Tick universe, Arthur's is the sidekick to a character, the Tick, who does have superpowers. He might be an imbecile. He might be an idiot. But he is super strong and invulnerable. Arthur is not, though, and runs a significant risk whenever there's danger. And I love it, but only because it's self-aware. I don't know how I would feel otherwise. And question number 5 is your most loved comic book publisher. And for me, that would be DC Comics, the publisher of Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman and the Justice League and the Justice Society and the Legion of Superheroes and the Flash, Aquaman, Green Lantern, all the real superheroes. As opposed to, if you're talking superheroes, Marvel Comics, which was remade by Stan Lee in the 1960s, so that, as Stan Lee often told his bullpen, I don't want any Supermans. No Supermen. Everybody's got to have hang-ups. Nobody can have an easy time of it. These have got to be relatable people, no matter what their superpowers are. And that was largely true. I mean, maybe it wasn't quite true for Thor. He had a human alter ego that was vulnerable, but not psychologically imbalanced. But the closest that Thor came to having something like that would be the generation gap, because he was constantly fighting with his father, Odin, the king of the gods. But otherwise, all Marvel heroes have hang-ups. They have times when they're in moods, when they're not happy. There are parts of their life that disappoint them. They have trouble making the rent. They have relatives or co-workers or bosses that are constantly giving them a hard time. And Stan Lee made a point of that in the so-called writing bullpen at Marvel. He made a point of making that be true. I've always found that a little tedious. I understand it works. Stan Lee made it work. A lot of his subsequent writers have made it work. Some classic moments have arisen from that. But still, the standard reduction of Marvel and DC is that DC heroes are gods trying to be human, whereas Marvel heroes are humans trying to be gods. And if you make me choose between the two, I'm going to prefer DC heroes for that reason. Which I guess explains why consistently my two favorite Marvel heroes are the ones that don't have that don't have the Stan Lee mandated hang-ups. Thor would be the first one. In his normal identity as the Norse god of thunder, he is just a noble battler, that's all. And the other would be Doctor Strange, who has Stan Lee-style foibles in his first appearance. We're told that he is an arrogant surgeon. And then he has a car crash that destroys the fine motor control of his hands and humbles his pride in the process. And then he gets over it. He can't ever use his hands to operate again. But he becomes a master of the mystic arts. And after that, there are no hang-ups. It's just, for most of the time, for the most part, Doctor Strange is just a slightly older, maybe that has something to do with it, a slightly older Marvel superhero who has his act together and just has problems that he faces. And that has always made Thor and Doctor Strange more revisitable for me. So it would be DC. In DC Comics, that is where my lifeblood is. That is where I follow the adventures of Adam Strange on the planet Ron. I've followed the Justice League as they go into all sorts of parallel dimensions. I've followed Superman and Batman in World's Finest. I've followed Superboy in the Legion of Superheroes. That is where my heart is DC Comics. Then question number 6 is your most loved screen-to-print or print-to-screen adaptation. And when it comes to screen-to-print, I don't really have anything to comment on. But print-to-screen? Ooh, yes. I've contended on this channel many times that print-to-screen adaptations always improve. Comic books make this especially true. Not always. In the first example that I want to give you, I would call it a dead even tie. I would dearly love it if AI technology made it possible for this series to continue indefinitely. But I'm talking about The Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves as the Man of Steel, which I loved, absolutely loved, even though I could tell, even when I was watching it originally, when it was broadcasting originally, that there wasn't a whole lot of money on the special effects. It didn't matter at all. George Reeves was a special effect, and he, I think, knew that. He was, unlike anyone else who's ever played Superman, he was also an accomplished actor, and decided to bring a little of that to a kid's production. So it's often been commented, and I agree, that George Reeves is the most alien Clark Kent and the most human Superman that we have. And the lackluster special effects budget doesn't matter at all. When the bad guys have Jimmy Olsen on ice in some cabin in the woods somewhere, and they're threatening him, and Superman is flying to his rescue, and we hear that high-pitched whistling sound that they used for Superman in flight, we're not the only ones who hear it. The bad guys also hear it. Long before he arrives, they hear it, and it sounds like it's coming from everywhere. It's awesome, absolutely awesome. And it's capped by something that I think is all the more powerful because it's not CGI, and that is George Reeves blasting his way personally through a fake wall. That never got old for me. What happened when he blasted through that wall was a foregone conclusion. There was no hope of defeating George Reeves' Superman, unless you had some sort of outre method, but the bad guys always had just guns. And that was just delightful. Just delightful. Now, I'm not saying that is better than the comic book, but George Reeves in The Adventures of Superman was about as close as you could get to a print-to-screen perfect adaptation of the Kurt Swan Superman. So I'll take it. But another, it's not exactly print-to-screen, except in a general sense, would be Avengers Endgame. The gigantic culminating movie of the first enormous 20-movie arc of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that ends with a gigantic, prolonged confrontation between all of the Avengers and Thanos. And I thought it was just incredible. Just incredible. I knew that it was going to be a special effects palooza. I knew that because everybody involved with it had said, this is the last hurrah for the first era of Marvel Comics, which was an unprecedented cinematic achievement. 20 interlinked movies all building towards a climax. No one ever dreamed of anything like that before. And it worked. It worked with only a few chapters that dropped the ball. And so I knew there was going to be a ton of special effects at the end of Avengers Endgame, but I wasn't expecting the comedy or the emotional payoffs, and I got them. My God, I got them in spades. The last hour of Avengers Endgame is the most effective Marvel movie ever made, and the most effective superhero movie ever made. I thought it was incredible, just incredible. And the last print-to-screen adaptation that I want to mention is going to cause some eyebrows to go up among you comic book fans, because it is a case in point of my oft-made contention that the adaptation, the movie or the TV adaptation, is usually better than the print version it comes from. And the thing I'm talking about here is The Watchman, which was a 12-issue miniseries that was made into a graphic novel by Alan Moore that is widely considered one of the greatest graphic novels, one of the greatest superhero comic books of all time. It and Batman Dark Knight Returns. Watchmen is reprinted at least once every year, and not only because of demand, there are collectors who want every edition of Watchmen, but also to keep the property out of Alan Moore's hands. Can you imagine how wealthy he would be? And it would revert to him if Marvel didn't use it, so they use it. Or DC didn't. If DC didn't use it, that's the deal. If they let it go fallow, it reverts to Alan Moore, and you don't want the property of the Watchmen reverting to anybody. And the graphic novel has been the subject of doctoral dissertations. It's been the subject of endless video analysis and whatnot. And yet, Scott Snyder's movie adaptation of The Watchmen is much better than the comic book Watchmen. Much better. It not only retains all of the great visual scenes, the great beats, the great moments, quiet and loud, from The Watchmen, but it fixes the mess of the main plot. I'm not gonna spoil that main plot, but it's obvious that Alan Moore was making that main plot up piecemeal as he went along, and it only came to fruition in his mind at the very end. And it's totally extraneous. It's ridiculously overcomplicated. It doesn't make any sense, especially when you consider the character who cooks it up, who is a character in The Watchmen who would have a final plan that makes sense, that is simple and elegant and makes sense. And the Scott Snyder and his writers for the movie version of The Watchmen change that overall plot gimmick, the main plot of the whole arc, into something that is simple and that does make sense. They improve it. Just plain simple, improve it. And then a lot of other stuff. There are a lot of little details. I could take you frame by frame through the Snyder Watchmen and point out to you, all right, well, this is an adaptation of this moment in the graphic novel, but notice how much better it is. So I'm going to say The Watchmen is a perfect example, probably the quintessential example of something screen to film where the film is just better. Let's see here. Number 7 is most loved newly published trade paperback or comic or graphic novel. It's not trade paperback, but it is a hardcover, and it is newly published. It's this thing. 75 years celebration of Superboy. There's Superboy with the Dog of Steel. This is just incredible. It's comic reprints from all of Superboy's comic book history. I loved it. Just got it the other day. Question number 8 is... question number 8 is another bit of a problem. Most beloved POC comic book creator or comic book featuring a POC character. And I don't like the term POC because POC is just fine. Means you're on the right side of history, means you're an ally. If you say POC, you are an ally, you're on the right side of history. But if you say Seed P, then you're worse than Hitler. You deserve to be canceled, no job, no social security, no food, no food for your children. You deserve to be annihilated from the world just for that. And POC and Seed P are exact synonyms. They're exactly the same. They mean exactly the same thing. If you can have such a world of difference based on one preposition, then you're not talking about meaning. You're talking about coded language. And I don't like coded language because somebody has to do the coding. And it's inherently distrustful to me. I don't like even using the terms. Once I know it's code speech, and in this case it is actually code speech. It can't be literal otherwise because the two words, POC and Seed P, mean exactly the same thing. If you're putting that much weight on a preposition, then you have other goals in mind than clarity or sanity of use or whatever, and your main goal is control. And I don't like that at all. But in the spirit of the tag, and interpreting here, it could change in a minute. It could change since the whole purpose of this kind of coded speech is to control what you do. Once you do this, that purpose is void, and now you need another term, and the purpose will be to control you enough to get you to use that term. And do you use it, or do you risk being called worse than Hitler for something that is semantically identical? But in the spirit of the tag, and interpreting POC as in the racist sense that it's meant of someone who's not white, for a creator, I would say, for an older creator, I would say George Perez, who is one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. And I believe still working today, although maybe he only does commission work at conventions. That can be quite a tidy sum of money to just go to convention, park at a table, and have a line of people who want to commission their own original George Perez piece of artwork for a substantial sum of money, and every one of them is willing to pay it. So you come up to George Perez's table, you shake his hand, or maybe you don't shake his hand now, maybe there aren't conventions anymore, but it used to be. You would say hi to him, you would say, I really admire your work, I'm a big fan, he's a nice guy, so he would be very happy to hear that. And then he would say, so what are you thinking? And you would give him a commission. And there would be grades of what to do, depending on how complicated the commission is. So let's say you had $500 to spend. Then you would commission George Perez to draw a picture his own rendition of the famous panel where Superman encounters Supergirl for the first time as she is springing out of the rocket that brought her to Earth. Only you want George Perez to draw it, and you want him to sign it and date it. And it's just yours, and there's no other copy of it anywhere in the world. Then you pay $500, and he would say, okay, this is simple. It's 2 figures and a background, so check back in an hour or 2. And then you'd have somebody who'd come by and maybe at the beginning of a day to George Perez, or somebody else, doesn't have to be George Perez, some other famous, beloved artist, and say, maybe you go to George Perez's table and you say, here's what I want. I want the classic Jim Shooter era Legion of Superheroes, a gigantic team portrait of the Legion of Superheroes. Doesn't matter if you don't get the costumes exactly right, you're doing it all from memory, but that's what I want. And I'm willing to pay you $15,000. Well, okay, then George Perez is not available for the rest of the day for anybody else, and he will just do that. That it could be plenty of old-time comic book artists do that now. They just do the circuit. Don't know what they're doing in the pandemic era. They certainly aren't welcome. They're old-style craftsmen who tell visual stories. Why would they be welcome at DC or Marvel today? I have no idea. But in terms of POC, if we use George Perez as an old example, and then as a new example, it would be Jorge Jimenez, a young artist who has just gone from strength to strength. He just gets better and better with every comic that he draws. He's about to have a massive hit for DC Comics, the Joker War. I predict that it will be huge. I've already seen, he posts online, I've already seen bits and pieces of his artwork, and it's even better than his run on the Justice League that just ended, and that was light years better than the last thing he drew. So it's going to be fun to watch him just get better and better. That is fantastic, and I bet he could do a brisk business at conventions, doing commissions, if there are conventions anymore, but I don't think there are. I don't think there ever will be again. And Jorge Jimenez also, I mean, when George Perez was just starting out at Marvel Comics, drawing Fantastic Four and whatnot, he was a mighty nice guy and mighty personable. Jorge Jimenez is a mighty nice guy and mighty personable, and also a super hottie. So you've got that too. I don't know if that factors into POC. Let's just get off that altogether, shall we? Question number 9 is, which comic book world would you most like to live in? I get this question in book tags all the time, and I don't. My answer is the same. I wouldn't want to live in any of these worlds. I mean, picture what it's like to be an ordinary person in a comic book world where super beings throw cars at each other, or tear up the sidewalk, or mentally possess everyone within 100 miles or whatnot. I wouldn't want to do that. Or you might think, okay, well, maybe you get to be a superhero. But that's even less appealing. Yes, you have superpowers, but so do your enemies. And if an enemy of yours who has more superpower than you do decides they want to kill you, what are you going to do? You'll fight as hard as you can in downtown Manhattan, killing how many people in the process, and then you'll die yourself. There's no law. There's nowhere you can go. So, no, I don't want to live in a comic book world at all. No. And then question number 10 is to tag some booktubers. And this tag's gone on long enough, and I don't know who to tag here. If you read comics, I don't know how many people read comics. A lot of booktubers, I suspect, read them but don't talk about them. If you read comics and you want to do this, I would love to hear your answers. I'm not going to tag anybody specifically. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. This has gone way too long. But I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.